Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to have this conversation today about abolition and kind of getting a jump start to it. Um, Today we have speaking Orisanmi Burton, who is at American University and part of the Abolition Journal Collective. And we also have Kaylee Swift behind the scenes doing all the great technical stuff and really setting this up. I didn't know you could do YouTube like this. It's really fantastic. It's really great. I'm really excited for this. So what I want to do real quick for like a minute or so is kind of contextualize why we're having this abolition 101. And it kind of stems from a lot of the on the ground work by Black Visions Collective and by Reclaim the Block and other abolitionist groups within the Twin Cities and the work they're doing to put forth the vision of the future. And with that vision set, what we have now is trying to get everybody else on board and getting us to that vision. And the cool thing I feel about abolition is that, the work is collective and it looks a little bit different depending on the people you're with or how you even see it as an individual. And so because of that, this talk today doesn't necessarily give definitives, but it creates a set of knowledge to build from it and do what you have to do and really bring that conversation and how it meets your own needs. And that's kind of the work that we want to do today is give people the skills, give people kind of not this, but the ideas to really develop how you want to think about your relationship to abolition, in particular with prisons and the police. And so with that said, I want to kind of end with this quote that I've been thinking about recently, and it's from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Store, A Parable of the Store, and it reads, "There is no end to what a living world will demand of you." And I think abolition, that whole process it's a journey. And what we think of it as now may change over time. And I look forward to hearing what y'all have to say. And we have a Google form if you want to follow up with us in the future. And I just look forward to carrying this conversation forward as we really try to bring this in and bring abolition to the forefront. So I'm going to turn it over right now. Thank you.
Greetings. Thanks so much for that introduction, Aaron. And thank everyone for joining us from wherever you are. And I want to express my thanks to the organizers on the ground in Minneapolis. We're so inspired by what we see emerging from there. And, I'm really happy to be able to be a part of it in this small way. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to turn off my camera. Right on. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge and foreground the fact that these remarks are the result of collective intellectual and political labor. And that what I know about abolition and teach about abolition, I have learned from elders in the movement, as well as from contemporary abolitionist organizers and scholars and thinkers and doers, many of whom are Black women and other women of color. As the title, Abolition 101, suggests, this workshop is intended to introduce you to some of the history, core themes, principles, and strategies of abolition. It does not presuppose that you have any prior knowledge of these ideas, and it is not by any means comprehensive, as Aaron so eloquently said. What I'm going to do in this talk is offer some definitions of abolition, and then I'm going to offer an abolitionist analysis of what we call the criminal punishment system. Next, I'm going to talk about crime versus harm. And finally, I'm going to talk about reform versus abolition. A note on language. Throughout this talk, I refer to policing, prisons, and the criminal punishment system more broadly, fairly interchangeably. And that is because, for the purposes of this conversation, I am emphasizing the functional unity of these institutions, even though at a lower level of abstraction, they operate differently and have different capacities. What I hope this will provide is some theoretical grounding for the many struggles that are on the horizon. And theory is not just for academics. Theory is for everyone. Amir Cabral, reminds us that nobody has yet made a successful revolution without revolutionary theory. So let's start by defining abolition. For Mumia Abu-Jamal, a former member of the Black Panther Party, writing as a political prisoner for nearly 40 years, abolitionists are simply put those beings who look upon their time and say, no. So here, abolition is construed primarily as a refusal against a force that is understood to be an unjust force. And again, think about that context, that this man is a political prisoner for nearly 40 years. An abolitionist organization known as Critical Resistance defines abolition as a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So here, abolition is understood to be a particular way of seeing and thinking that is not only about the no, the refusal, but also about the yes, in the form of the lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Similarly, Angela Davis, one of the preeminent theorists of abolition, argues that what she, drawing on the scholarship of W.E.B. Du Bois, calls abolition democracy is not only or even primarily about abolition as a negative process of tearing down, but it is also about building up, about creating new institutions. Abolitionist scholar Dylan Rodriguez describes abolition as the production of freedom and liberation practices from within collective rebellion, insurgency, and community. So abolition here is that which emerges from the act of engaging in collective struggle. And I think this would probably resonate with a lot of people right now who participated in the protests, who participated in the uprisings, and are now seeing new forms of organization, new forms of discourse emerging out of that struggle. So struggle itself is productive. And finally, abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore centers abolition's revolutionary ambition when she writes, abolition requires that we change one thing, which is everything. When one says prison abolition, one cannot be talking about only prison. It's building the future from the present in all the ways we can. When I think about abolition, I think about the prison as a strategic site to focus our attentions, because it's a site in which many of the contradictions that are present throughout the society are concentrated and plainly visible. So what I am trying to emphasize here is that there is no singular definition of abolition. There are, in fact, a diversity of conceptualizations, some of which are productively in tension with each other. But for me, the broader unity is that they all mobilize a profound faith in the capacity of human beings, of everyday people, to articulate and organize and struggle for what they need and what they want and what they deserve. When we talk about abolition, we're talking about an ongoing historical process that will always need to be struggled over and developed and expanded. We're talking about the fact that there will never be a time in which the contradictions and struggles that are emerging through this process will cease to exist. But we argue that the world we are building will be better for the majority of the people on the surface of this earth than the world that we are currently inhabiting. So now I want to talk about policing from an abolitionist perspective. Our position is that policing and prisons are instruments of class warfare. And one of the key ways we make this claim is by analyzing history, by doing abolitionist historiography. So the first modern police force in the United States emerged in the early 18th century in the form of Southern slave patrols. And these slave patrols were implemented to ensure that the planter class, the land-owning, slave-holding Southern elite, continued to reap profits from enslaved labor. Slave patrols enforced the subjugation of African populations by ensuring that Africans did not organize or resist or plot to burn the plantations down. Importantly, though, these slave patrols were also a way to control the behaviors of white people, or more accurately, European immigrants who would soon become white. And this is because the white males that were conscripted to go on patrol did not, by and large, own human chattel. They were of the lower classes. They were not in positions to reap the full economic benefits of the plantation system. Thus, their ability to go on patrol, to exercise a police power based on the color of their skin and to assert dominance over enslaved populations, who they might otherwise be in solidarity with, served to stoke interracial animosity and mask the potential for class solidarity, the potential for a multiracial rebellion against the planter class. The roots of modern policing can also be found in the western parts of the United States, where European settlers established militias which used genocidal violence to preserve the integrity of the western frontier and prevent Native people from reclaiming their indigenous land. In large cities in the North, wealthy citizens established night watch brigades in which European immigrants from the lower classes were hired to guard property owned by elites. We can also talk about the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which in the 19th century was used to violently crush radical organizing for workers' rights. Or we could talk about how during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of imperialism, we saw the growth of policing on the colonial peripheries in the territories as a way to suppress resistance against imperial domination. So these are some of the key sources that constitute the origin of policing. Obviously, a lot of things have changed since that time. One of the key changes that people often point to as an example of progress is that these institutions are much more diverse in terms of their ethno-racial composition and their gender composition. But to that, we would say that the foundational logics of these institutions, their core imperatives, are still very much intact. The violent police repression of the popular uprisings that erupted in the wake of George Floyd's public lynching is a contemporary example of this. Protesters have constantly pointed out that the police seem to care more about property than human life. Another recent example is how in 2016, massive police force was deployed to crush protests led by Native people who were resisting the desecration of their sacred land and the poisoning of the water supply, which supports human and non-human life. So in both instances, the interests of capital, of finance, of property, and profit accumulation superseded the preservation and enhancement of life. At a macro level, then, we say that policing in prisons are a strategy for maintaining peace and order under conditions of social and economic inequality, conditions which, of course, are intensifying globally. A 2020 study by Oxfam found that there are 2,153 billionaires in the world, and that these billionaires have more wealth than 60% of the world's population combined, 4.6 billion people. How do you maintain peace and order in this context? Well, you do it in a lot of ways, but one of the primary ways is through the forces of organized violence, policing, prisons, military. And this is why throughout the world, the vast majority of people who are in prisons are poor. An abolitionist approach mobilizes this broader historical and structural analysis. And it should go without saying that this analysis stands in stark contrast to the dominant liberal mode of interpreting policing. The dominant liberal mode of interpreting policing is an individualized, dehistoricized, and decontextualized discourse, not only with regard to the historical role of the police, but also regarding the root causes of crime and violence. In Policing the Crisis, a classic work of radical criminology, researchers at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, Alabama, wrote, to blame the actions of individuals within a given historical structure without taking that structure itself into account is an easy and familiar way of exercising the moral conscience without bearing any of its costs. It is the last refuge of liberalism. So this liberal mode of interpretation is itself a form of violence. It's a form of psychological and epistemic violence. An abolitionist approach says, how can we transform the organization of society, the distribution of resources, and our social relationships such that these forces of organized violence become obsolete? We argue that the root causes, not only of crime, but also, and more importantly, the root causes of harm are that people are not getting their basic needs met in terms of food, housing, education, healthcare, employment, and even leisure. It argues that those of us who are really interested in justice, rather than simply peace within the context of injustice, must focus our energies toward ensuring that everyone, at minimum, has their basic needs met, has access to what we would call basic human rights. So abolitionist strategy is about decreasing the reach of these forces of organized violence, which are rooted in class warfare, racial domination, and patriarchal rule, while simultaneously expanding these life-affirming institutions. This is the philosophical basis of abolition. And this is the theory that needs to inform the mounting calls to defund the police. Let's move on to a discussion of crime versus harm. Crime can be succinctly defined as an act that is subject to criminal sanction. In other words, crimes are behaviors that have been criminalized by the state. Crime is not a fixed object, as criminalized behaviors vary widely across time and space. Those behaviors that are criminalized and prioritized by law enforcement are often linked to broader strategies of state social control and political repression. So we need to understand that criminalization is the exercise of state power, where the state is again concerned with the preservation of peace and order within a context of profound injustice. There's an important book by Khalil Gibran Muhammad called The Condemnation of Blackness, which demonstrates that the emergence of crime statistics in the late 19th century, the scientific measurement of crime, was essentially a political project used to criminalize Blackness and justify the white supremacist social organization of American society. So abolitionists think and write a lot about crime and criminalization, but we also write and think a lot about harm. And a lot of the thinking about harm, as opposed to crime, comes out of a tradition of Black and women of color-led abolitionist feminism. And I want to specifically highlight a work that was really influential for me, the Insight Women of Color Against Violence anthology. The focus of these abolitionist feminists on harm as opposed to crime was an effort to shift our gaze to those interpersonal, intra and intercommunal, and structural behaviors and arrangements that produce suffering and violence and premature death. So this is a much more expansive notion, much more expansive than merely worrying and focusing and fighting against crime. There are many acts that cause harm that are not crimes. For example, building a massive oil pipeline that desecrates indigenous land that then ruptures, poisoning the source of life on Earth, is not a crime in the formal sense, even though it causes incalculable harm. On the other hand, the practice of squatting, by which houseless people take over abandoned lands or buildings so that they can have a place to live, is considered criminal trespass, even though it causes no harm or minimal harm. So all crimes do not cause harm, and all harms are not classified as crime. Rather, criminalization, the process by which the state turns a behavior or a category of person into a crime should be understood again as an exercise of power that privileges property and profits over people and the environment. So if we want to build a just society, abolitionists argue that we need to focus on harm reduction rather than on crime reduction. The system as it stands is focused on criminalizing lawbreakers, incapacitating them, either in prisons or with electronic ankle shackles or through legalized employment discrimination, and on punishing them. But it would be difficult for anyone to make a convincing case that the system as it is presently constituted is focused on harm reduction. The reason why much of this core thinking about the importance of centering harm comes out of a woman of color feminist tradition is because women of color and people of color who defy gender norms, such as Black trans women, have learned through experience that calling the police and attempting to use the criminal punishment system as a means of protecting themselves from violence, sometimes violence, often violence, which occurs at the hands of men they know and are close to in their communities, that often this reliance on the police has led to additional harm being inflicted on them, on their families, and on their communities at the hands of the state. This comes in the form of police violence against them and their families. It comes in the form of incarceration, which breaks apart families, and it comes in the form of the child welfare system, which has its own racist history, one that is tied very closely to the history of prisons and policing. So I want to urge you to check out the Say Her Name report, which was released in 2015, and which details the specific ways that police violence targets Black women and girls. And again, often they experience this violence after calling or otherwise relying on police. This is essential to understand because one of the uninformed critiques of abolition is that abolitionists don't care about violence and harm, or that they don't think about people who've experienced violence or harm. But this is simply untrue because some of the core thinking and organizing and theorizing around how you actually put abolition into practice in your daily life, in your community, in your household, has emerged from women of color who have experienced violence and yet who still fight for abolition. These are people who care so deeply about reducing harm and violence that they have developed community accountability practices and restorative justice practices that aim to reduce harms inflicted within the community, as well as reducing harms inflicted by the state. And they have done this based on the understanding that the communities themselves and not the criminal punishment system are the agents of harm reduction. Their work and their insights are a generalizable model for abolitionist politics more broadly. Now I want to talk about the relationship between reform and abolition. The first thing I want to say is that the criminal punishment system is reforming all the time. The modern prison emerged as a reform of the death penalty, which was the dominant mode of punishment for white people in the 17th century. So it's a reform from its inception and has been reforming ever since. The definition of reform that I like comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines reform as to form, shape, or mold a second time, to form over again, or to reshape. I like this definition because it's value neutral. Here, reform simply means to change. Most of the definitions of reform, or when you hear reform deployed in the popular media, people use it to assume that reform automatically means harm reduction, but it doesn't. Reform is value neutral. And again, these systems are always already in a process of reform. So to say that you support prison reform or police reform is really to say nothing at all. Reform in and of itself has no objective content. In popular discourse, police and prison reform implies the removal of allegedly anomalous abuses of power or some kind of technical tweak to a process that isn't working properly. Abolitionists are pointing to the ways in which these institutions enact a historical continuity of class warfare, racial subjugation, and patriarchal domination. We therefore do not want to improve the criminal punishment system. We do not want it to be more efficient or effective. We want to render it obsolete by transforming the underlying conditions that make them appear necessary. Activists have known this for a long time, especially those who have been directly impacted by the criminal punishment system. For example, in 1972, an imprisoned Black man named Joseph Little, who had been released from New York's Attica prison just days after having survived the infamous state-led massacre of 39 people in response to a massive rebellion in 1971, stood before a prison reform commission and defiantly proclaimed, "Here it is, 1972. Everyone wants to get on the political bandwagon. Everyone is down with penitentiary reform. Let us make the penitentiary a holiday inn. I am not for no penitentiary reform. I am for abolishing the whole concept of penitentiary reform." So abolitionists reject the notion that reform is an inherently humanist endeavor. However, this does not mean that we reject reform outright. We understand that it is highly improbable that we will win the world we want, the world without prisons and policing, in an instantaneous moment of victory. Rather, we understand ourselves to be engaged in a protracted struggle, a struggle that occurs across multiple domains of society, and that we therefore have to engage in struggles over reform and through reform. But we have to do this as part of a broader abolitionist strategy. And the way that we do this is by being clear about the types of reforms we support and those we reject. In other words, thinking about reform and abolition as opposing projects, as necessarily opposed, is not always helpful. Rather, when engaging with formal political institutions, we oppose what we call reformist reform, and we support and fight for what we call non-reformist reform or abolitionist reform. Abolitionists across the world are thinking about this and writing about this and putting this into practice. But the concept was first articulated by André Gorz, a French theorist, in an essay called Strategy for Labor. He wrote, "A reformist reform is one which subordinates its objectives to the criteria of rationality and practicability of a given system and policy. Reformism rejects those objectives and demands, however deep the need for them, which are incompatible with the preservation of the system. So reformist reforms follow the path of least resistance. They are inherently conservative insofar as they aim to conserve the system that is already in place, regardless of its ethics or morality." On the other hand, writes Gorz, a not necessarily reformist reform is one which is conceived not in terms of what is possible within the framework of a given system and administration, but in view of what should be made possible in terms of human needs and demands. He continues, in other words, a struggle for non-reformist reforms, anti-capitalist reforms, is one which does not base its validity and its right to exist on capitalist needs, criteria, and rationales. A non-reformist reform is determined not in terms of what can be, but what should be. And finally, it bases the possibility of obtaining its objectives on the implementation of fundamental political and economic changes. The changes can be sudden, just as they can be gradual, but in any case, they assume a modification of the relations of power. So I know that's a lot, but it's useful, and hopefully you can return to it. This is something we have to think about and operationalize. A non-reformist reform is a reform that takes power away from the state and places it in the hands of the communities that are asserting the demand, while a reformist reform does not sufficiently interrupt the state's asymmetrical relation of power. So the method for differentiating between a reformist reform and a non-reformist reform is to analyze how the balance of power shifts or does not shift as a result of a given reform. For example, police body cameras are a reformist reform because they enhance the surveillance capabilities of the state. Body cam footage used to expose the alleged abuses of police power, but they also are used to surveil and criminalize already vulnerable populations. And studies are showing that they have little impact on police behavior. What's so beautiful about this moment for folks in Minneapolis is that you have several potentially non-reformist reforms in the pipeline, potentially non-reformist reforms. So the decision by the Minneapolis School Board to terminate the police department's contract with the public school system is a potentially abolitionist reform or non-reformist reform. It's not automatically an abolitionist reform because, as I said earlier, abolition is a protracted struggle. So kicking the cops out of the school district was a victory, but that was the negative action, the removal of the forces of organized violence. The more difficult task is going to be figuring out how the community is going to meet the needs of its students outside of a policing logic, while simultaneously doing political education so that teachers, students, staff, and community members understand this as an abolitionist strategy and support it as such. That's the work. That's the work of abolition, and I know we can do it. So I want to make a few final comments by way of a conclusion. First, I just want to remind us why we're here, why so many people want to have this conversation at this particular historical moment. Revisionists are already claiming that it's because people are so outraged by the grotesque sight of George Floyd's lynching that they were moved to act. And some people undoubtedly were. But by and large, the reason why politicians and people who had never uttered the words Black Lives Matter in their lives are bending over backwards to say Black Lives Matter, and why white supremacist statues, which were once so cherished, are suddenly coming down on their own all across the world, is because people throughout the country and throughout the world rose up in righteous expressions of rage. Let us remember that. That's why things are suddenly moving so fast. Second, I want to say that in response to this popular uprising, we've obviously seen the eruption of intense police repression. And we should be prepared for that to continue because it will. Simultaneously, we're also going to see and are already seeing the dissemination of a massive police propaganda campaign, which is going to aim to rebuild support and legitimacy for the police, further demonize protesters, and separate protesters into good and bad categories, and delegitimize those that are put in the bad category, right? The peaceful protester versus violent protester dichotomy is a trap. I also want to say that reformist reforms are going to be on offer. And when our collective rage settles, those reformist reforms might feel enticing. But what we have to do is continue to foster our radical imagination and think about what we really want and think big and make big demands and organize and fight, because that is what this moment calls for. And if this was your introduction to abolitionist theory and you have unanswered questions or things that make you uncomfortable, know that this is potentially a good thing. As abolitionists, we don't propose to have a pre-existing, ready-made model for the world we are building. Our imaginations in many instances are constrained by the violence and the struggles that we're engaged in this world. But we're building the world that we want as we fight for that world. So we have to be creative, and we have to demonstrate some revolutionary optimism. So if you have unanswered questions, form a study group and get involved in abolitionist organizations and support people that are being arrested and imprisoned to the extent that you are able to. So I'll leave you with a quote from Assata Shakur. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
All right, let me get back. Thank you so much for that. That was really great. I want to thank Orisanmi Burton for his contributions. I want to thank Kaylee Swift for the technical stuff, the technical end, which is really important to what we're doing. And if you have questions, comments, or concerns, please fill out the Google Sheet, and we'll be getting to folks about following up on certain things. And please share the video for folks to get an education about this. Thank you so much for participating. I look forward to seeing you out in the struggle. Thanks.